80 years ago, on November 19th, 1942, the Operation Uranus, led by the Red Army with overwhelming superiority, began. The goal was to encircle and destroy the German Sixth Army and Allied troops in and around Stalingrad. 4 days later, on the 23rd, the encirclement was completed at the railway station Saujetsky near Kalak, shown in green. There is no battle more well known than Stalingrad, and hardly any military action of the Second World War has been researched so intensively, yet also judged so differently. However, if you look at the studies from the past decades, it becomes apparent that many of the books and reports written after the war by the German military leaders responsible at the time, if the generals survived the Soviet show trials and were released back to Germany, have increasingly faded into the background or have been dismissed as attempts to whitewash their own actions. Especially among newspaper editors, when it comes to the Battle of Stalingrad, a one-sided, subjective, and superficial reporting style is often noticeable. This also includes, for example, the inaccurate comparison of the surrender of the Afrika Korps with that of the Sixth Army. This tendency, noticeable in Germany at least since the 1980s, to view political or military events or personalities in a somewhat know-it-all and moralizing way, makes it difficult to let just the facts speak when it comes to events of the 20th century. This also applies, partly due to the still relatively recent nature of the events, to those that took place on February 19th. To understand the situation at that time, even if this is only possible to a limited extent today, one must try to detach oneself from all the post-catastrophic wisdom of self-proclaimed general staff experts, specialists, or peace researchers with professor or editor titles. Their works are often merely reproductions of the wisdom of earlier authors. One often hears the demand that the Sixth Army should have broken out at any cost. But with this demand that allows no alternatives, one is once again committing the fundamental flaw of today's view of history. First, knowing the results that came afterward, and second, including them in the considerations. To reinforce the supposed infallibility of their theses, attributes like irresponsible, cowardly, or blindly obedient to authority are quickly thrown in. But with this, for example, one does not do justice to the personality of the Commander-in-Chief of the Sixth Army, Friedrich Paulus, on the left, nor to the Chief of Staff of the Army, Major General Arthur Schmidt, in the center of the picture. Here they were identified at their capture during the downfall of their army. They were by no means weak personalities who tended toward blind obedience, but rather, if you look at their military evaluations and achievements, they can be described as above average. On the other hand, it can be argued that their operational excellence should have led them to make more independent decisions much earlier. One of the main reasons for the catastrophe was the failure to withdraw the advanced Sixth Army in time, before the expected major enemy offensive began. Because by doing so, they could have avoided the impending enemy attack, significantly shortened the front, and thus created reserves. The repeatedly mentioned need to block the Volga as a transport route would have been achieved by spring anyway, due to the annual ice drift and the freezing of the river. If you want to shorten the time spent analyzing the battle, or boil it down to a very simple point, you just have to look at the German training guidelines for general staff officers since General von Schlieffen. In these guidelines, and not just in the Prussian army, the encirclement battle of Cannae played a major role, where on August 2nd, 216 before Christ, the Carthaginian army under Hannibal destroyed the numerically superior Romans with their 16 legions. In general staff training, this ancient encirclement battle was considered almost a dogma by many instructors. In fact, many victorious battles against the Red Romans were a rehearsed affair that took place on the largest Romanian playing fields. The relentless battle over the city of Stalingrad, too, was supposed to become a cannae of enormous proportions for the Red Army. But when discussing the Battle of Stalingrad, the most important thing often goes unmentioned. That is, the German Wehrmacht did not have an exclusive right to encirclement battles, but other armies, in this case the Soviet army, were also quite capable of planning, executing, and winning such battles. Every army in the world has had to learn from experience that the enemy too has studied Clausewitz, no matter the time or the theater of war. The German generals, some of whom spoke disparagingly of their opponents, also had to learn this lesson. Whether during the Allied invasion in 1944, in the encirclement battle lost south of Caen at Valais in early August, or up to April 1945, in the east, in the Halbe pocket, or in the Ruhr pocket in the west, when tens of thousands of German soldiers and civilians had fallen, and hundreds of thousands had been taken prisoner. As I now turn directly to the topic, I assume that the course of the Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from August 23, 1942 to February 2, 1943, is generally known in its broad outlines to those interested in military history, both from the German and Soviet perspectives. Therefore, I want to limit myself to the question of whether the Sixth Army could have been saved at all after November 23, 1942, the day the encirclement was completed. I would like to share some thoughts on the question of guilt, which still remains unresolved. Also about the alleged failure of the Air Force to supply the Army, as claimed by the Army after the war. And finally, whether the endurance of the Sixth Army until February 3, 1943, had any significance for the rest of the Eastern Front. What was the initial situation? After weeks of intense and costly fighting, by late October, nearly the entire city was under German control. However, dangerous Soviet diversionary attacks in the steppe between the Volga and the Don had also repeatedly to be repelled. In Stalingrad itself, the Red Army held only a narrow strip, 4 to 5 kilometers wide, with the Volga at their backs, but they defended this section with fanatical bravery against all German attacks. About the failed attempt to take this Soviet section during the last German offensive, the Battle of Stalingrad, I have already discussed Operation Hubertus, which was carried out mainly by engineer battalions from November 9th to 12th, 1942 in this video. Regardless of that, the Sixth Army had achieved its objective except for the supposedly insignificant remainder in the completely destroyed city. It had blocked Volga shipping and the land bridge between the Volga and Don, and was positioned in fortified positions in the Great Don Bend. But despite having achieved its objective, the situation of the army was by no means reassuring because it had been pushed forward in a spearhead to the Volga. Meanwhile, the Red Army was able to calmly prepare for an attack with superior and winter-hardened forces on both flanks of the German spearhead. To make matters worse, the most vulnerable points of the long, extended flanks on the right and left had been covered by large Romanian and Italian units. The left flank in particular had already been a cause for concern for the army leadership during the battle for Stalingrad. Since aerial and battlefield reconnaissance had reported enemy troop concentrations in front of the left neighbor and indicated their intention to attack from the large Donbass area, the 6th Army, on its own initiative, moved some tanks and anti-tank forces as well as an anti-aircraft regiment behind its left flanks. This looming threat of a major Soviet offensive was reported several times by the Army. However, the necessary reinforcement of the left neighbor, the 3rd Romanian Army, had been repeatedly delayed for various reasons. Another ongoing reason was the Army's supply situation with ammunition, fuel, and in some cases already with food. For example, this shortage had already led to the fact that, even before the major Soviet offensive on November 19th, counterattacks by the 14th German Panzer Corps under Lieutenant General Hans Valentin Hube could not be carried out due to a lack of fuel. Once again, during this campaign, the incredible distances had made themselves felt. All supplies had to be brought in on 2 single-track, low-capacity rail lines, of which the northernmost and most important one had ended about 60 kilometers before Stalingrad due to destroyed tracks and bridges. The terrain assessment revealed the following picture. The city of Stalingrad was long and narrow, stretching almost 50 kilometers along the west bank of the Volga. The city's edges were rarely wider than 4,000 meters, and sometimes only 1.5 kilometers wide. If you look at the battle maps of both armies involved, you'll see that only 3 terrain features of significance are marked there. The riverbank, which in some places was just high enough to offer landed troops a certain amount of protection. The Zaritsa River, a tributary of the Volga, which practically divided the city in half, and the Mamaya Kurgan, an ancient burial mound of the Tatars, a little over 100 meters high. Here is a view toward the city, and the opposite direction toward the Volga. This picture shows soldiers of the German Infantry Regiment 295 attempting to take this hill. The 6th Army's area, aside from the Great Don Bend and Volga positions, had no natural obstacles. It was a flat, gently rolling steppe, and trees were almost nowhere to be found along the banks of the Don. The few small villages and isolated wooden houses were more than inadequate as shelters or strongpoints. And the road network, if you could even call it that, was miserable. Actually, the only routes available were the so-called tracks created by troop movements, which were only solid and passable in dry weather, or when frozen, and which immediately turned into mud flats during thaw or rain. So, you were looking at a landscape that, only between the Don and Volga, had a few ancient burial mounds and the old fortification from earlier centuries, the so-called Tatar Ditch. In this terrain and in this situation, at 4 o'clock in the morning on November 19th, 1942, with Operation Uranus, 800 Soviet guns opened a 4-hour barrage in the combat zone of the Romanian 3rd Army near Kletskaya, which was followed at 8 o'clock in the morning by the first waves of tanks and infantry. The Soviet-Romanian balance of forces was 9-1. The Romanian 9th, 13th, and 14th Infantry Divisions, which were not at full strength and almost completely without anti-tank weapons, were crushed in a very short time. Only a few units of the 6th Infantry and 1st Cavalry Divisions held out for a few hours before they too were destroyed. A relief attack by the German 48th Panzer Corps and Lieutenant General Ferdinand Hamm with 2 divisions, the German 22nd Panzer Division and the Romanian 1st Panzer Division, against around 500 Russian T-34 and Klim Voroshilov 1 tanks led to the destruction of both large units. However, the 22nd German Panzer Division and Lieutenant General Eberhard Roth had only about 30 light tanks of the Czech type Praga TNH, or Panzerkampfwagen 38 armed mainly with a 37mm cannon. Meanwhile, The 1st Romanian Panzer Division, which was actually a pure infantry division, had been assigned 40 light Czech Panzer 35 tanks and captured French tanks. For example, the Renault R-35 was given the grand name of Panzer Division. The fully refreshed 29th Infantry Division, which was held in this area as an Army Group Reserve under Major General Hans-Georg Leiser, was assigned to a division of the 4th Panzer Army under Colonel General Hoth. It was caught in the middle of a Russian tank attack during a field exercise and was able to stop it. But a day later, Leiser's division received orders from Army Group B to cease all interventions, while at the same time placing the division under the command of the 6th Army. However, this change was only reported to the commander of the 6th Army, Colonel General Paulus, on the left a day later. So, the still fully combat-ready 29th Infantry Division, Mott initially remained in place to secure against a Soviet advance directly targeting Stalingrad. Meanwhile, however, it was now also able to expand westward in the south without interference. The Soviet army had gained ground and depth very quickly during its offensive, starting on November 19th, without being significantly held up by the aforementioned counterattack. The deployment of the Luftwaffe was also almost impossible, or severely restricted due to the dense fog, which also applied to aerial reconnaissance. A day later, on November 20th, the Red Army also attacked the right neighbor of the 6th Army, the poorly equipped 4th Romanian Army. Although some of their units had put up brave resistance, both Soviet spearheads were able to join deep behind the lines of the 6th Army. The 6th Army was surrounded and encircled on both sides, even though it wasn't directly attacked. However, their rear front was still open. On November 21st, Lieutenant General Friedrich Paulus, who was to be promoted to Colonel General on the 30th of the month, gathered the commanding generals of the Army Corps at the Army Command Post in Golubinskaya, 15 kilometers north of Kalach, to discuss the situation and its resulting consequences with them. The participants were Lieutenant General Walter Heitz, General of the Infantry Karl Strecker, General of the Armored Troops Hans Valentin Hube, General of the Artillery Walter Kurt von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, and Lieutenant General Erwin Janecka, who was promoted to the rare rank of General of the Engineers on December 1st, 1942. Accordingly, inside the pocket were the 4 Army Corps, an armored corps of the 4th Panzer Army, as well as numerous Army units from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht Reserve, such as assault engineer battalions, heavy army artillery, rocket launcher regiments, construction battalions, organization-taught construction columns, field post units, and ground organizations. In addition, there were the 9th Flak Division of the Air Force, the 9th Police Formation, and another 129 independent units in Stalingrad. From then on, the area held by the 6th Army, up to 40 kilometers away from the Volga, was referred to as Fortress Stalingrad. Thus, the army, with about 230,000 men, was surrounded in a pocket approximately 65 kilometers long from east to west, and about 35 kilometers deep from north to south. In the east, the front ran along the heights of the Volga River bank and through the city of Stalingrad, which was only partially still held by the Red Army. As best as they could, everyone dug themselves into the rock-hard frozen ground, wherever they happened to be. For the first time on November 21st, Paulus, here in the center of the picture, with General von Seydlitz-Kurzbach to the right, requested permission from Army Group B, which was responsible for him, and Field Marshal Maximilian von Weichs on the left, to abandon the Volga positions and withdraw the 6th Army. When this request was forwarded to the commander-in-chief of the army, who was at his house in Berchtesgadenwalde, he responded, "To the command post of the 6th Army, Führer's decision. The 6th Army is to keep the railway open as long as possible, despite the risk of temporary encirclement. An air supply order will follow." One day later, on November 22nd, after the transfer of the 6th Army High Command to Nizhny Tverskaya, a railway junction on the Don, that memorable situation briefing took place outside the encirclement ring. The Commander-in-Chief, General Paulus, his Chief of Staff, Major General Arthur Schmidt, the Commander-in-Chief of the 4th Panzer Army, Colonel General Hermann, who was also in command of the 4th Romanian Army, and the commander of the 6th Army, as well as the 9th Flak Division, Major General Wolfgang Pickert, had participated. Everyone was aware of the seriousness of being encircled, but it was also clear to them that the combat strength of the 6th Army was almost completely exhausted after more than 2 months of intense urban fighting. For example, in the 51st Army Corps under Lieutenant General von Seydlitz, 42% of all battalions were considered spent. And in the entire 6th Army, most infantry companies had fewer than 50 men, or most companies had been merged in order to be able to command tactical units at all. Now, there seems to be no doubt that an immediate breakout from the pocket would have been the most obvious thing to do, regardless of whether it was with or without approval from above. But this repeatedly demanded immediate abandonment of Stalingrad in the literature was, and still is, once again, due to the knowledge of the later fate of the 6th Army, and not to the consideration of the facts that were available at the time. Because at first, those strong German forces that were positioned in the large Don Bend, shown in Operation Blue, which were threatened from behind, had to be brought over the Don to the main forces of the army, which required time and fuel. Then the rear area of the army, which was endangered by the encirclement and now lay open to the Red Army, had to be secured. So, at that point, the immediate abandonment of Stalingrad was not possible, just as little as breaking out from a standstill. And that's exactly how the 6th Army High Command saw it as well. Here is its troop insignia. And in an initial decision, they determined to dig in, bring in forces from beyond the Don, and have the army supplied by air. From about the 19th to the 22nd of November, at that time still General of the Armored Troops, Paulus, reported to Army Group B. Southern front to the east, Don River still open, Don River frozen and crossable. Fuel supplies will soon be exhausted. Tanks and heavy weapons will then be immobile. Ammunition situation is critical. Rations will last 6 days. The army intends to hold the remaining area from Stalingrad to both sides of the Don and has taken all necessary measures to do so. The prerequisite is that the southern front can be closed and that ample supplies are flown in continuously. I request freedom of action in case forming a defensive position in the south does not succeed. The situation may then force us to abandon Stalingrad and the northern front in order to concentrate all our strength on defeating the enemy at the southern front between the Don and the Volga, and to establish a connection with the 4th Romanian Army here. An attack to the west is not promising due to strong enemy forces and difficult terrain. Signed, Paulus. 3 hours later, around 10 p.m., the 6th Army headquarters received Hitler's response with the order to hold their position. The 6th Army must know that I am doing everything to help and relieve them. I will give them my orders in due time. Then Hitler left Bavaria by train, heading toward the Führer headquarters Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. During the 18-hour train ride, he had the Chief of the Army General Staff, General of the Infantry, Kurt Zeitzler, inform him by phone every 2 hours about the situation between the Volga and the Don. Even now and later on, Zeitzler had repeatedly requested permission for a withdrawal, or, later, a breakout from the encirclement, which led to strong disagreements between him and Hitler. In addition to the information talks with Zeitzler, Hitler also conferred with the accompanying Chief of the Air Force General Staff, Colonel General Hans Jeschonek Blue Dot, and learned from him that Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had already ordered the preparation of air supply for the 6th Army with 500 tons daily. It can be assumed that Hitler's fateful decision to supply the encircled Sixth Army in the Stalingrad area by means of an airlift was made during this train journey. Again, one day later, on November 23rd at 9:30 p.m., Paulus sent this radio message to the Army group, and then at 11:45 p.m., also directly to the Führer headquarters Wolf's Lair, requesting freedom of action again. At this point in the Army High Command, Oberkommando de Heere, and in the staff of Army Group B under Field Marshal von Weichs, it was still firmly assumed that Hitler would approve the withdrawal of the Sixth Army in some form. Therefore, von Weichs had also instructed his staff at 10:45 a.m. on November 24th to immediately issue the breakout order for Paulus's army. But already more than 2 hours earlier, at 8:38 a.m., the decisive radio message from the Führer headquarters had arrived at the Sixth Army, bypassing Army Group B, and Paulus himself had received it. Führer's decision: the Sixth Army is briefly surrounded by Russian forces. I intend to concentrate the army in the area. The army can be assured that I will do everything to supply them accordingly and relieve them in time. The Sixth Army and Commander-in-Chief Weiss are ordered to fulfill their duty. Signed, Adolf Hitler. With this radio message, the decision was finally made against the breakout of the Sixth Army. The staff of Army High Command 6 had resigned themselves to their fate and, led by their Commander-in-Chief Paulus, had flown into the pocket to join the army. And this, even though the term Führer decision used in the radio message was neither a Führer order nor a Führer directive. The use of the term Führer decision merely described the highest level of urgency when transmitting messages within the command posts of the Wehrmacht. So, if a message marked as Führer decision arrived by radio or teletype, the transmission of all other messages of lower urgency had to be interrupted. The Führer's decision had to be sent as a priority. That was it. But as for the hoped-for supply by air, the Luftwaffe commanders questioned by the Sixth Army immediately and unanimously described it not only as very difficult, but, when it came to supplying an entire army in the harsh winter with all necessary goods, as simply impossible. Here is the very clear statement on this subject by the commanding general of the 8th Air Corps, Martin Fiebig. However, at first, a long-term air supply was not considered. It was only supposed to be carried out for a few days until the forces beyond the Don had been brought up, and the fuel necessary for the breakout of a motorized army and the additional ammunition required for such combat operations would have been flown in. But misfortune rarely comes alone. The Soviet pincer attack had cut off the rear units and supply depots from the army, while the units deployed on the main front line had only small stocks of fuel, ammunition, and provisions. However, in the Sixth Army, to ease what was assumed to be only a temporary worsening of the supply situation, they had decided to sacrifice the horse stock. In fact, they had also accepted that, as a result, all units dependent on horses, such as artillery supply and logistics units, would lose all their equipment and material in the event of a breakout. In itself, this plan, as cruel as it may sound for the animals involved, was the right measure in this situation. It could also have supported the army's supply for much longer. If, after the experience of the massive horse losses in the winter of 1941 to 1942, the withdrawal of a large part of the Sixth Army's horses to the Chir, the right tributary of the Don, had not been ordered in October, 1942, then 17,000 horses would have been brought from the 33 kilometers west of Stalingrad to Kalak on the Don, shown in yellow. Only 12,000 horses remained. The last one was slaughtered in the pocket on January 15, 1942. About the Luftwaffe. Despite serious concerns, it immediately began supplying with the available units of Air Fleet 4 under Luftwaffe Field Marshal Wolfram von Richthofen. Here he can be seen in 1942 at the controls of a Fiesler Storch. The landing site in the pocket was the centrally located Pitomnik airfield, secured by strong anti-aircraft artillery units and fighters 15 kilometers west of the city. One of 7 airfields in the Stalingrad pocket, here, then, and now. The others were Bolshaya Rososhka, Stalingradsky, Gumrak, Basagino, Voroponovo, and Karpovka. In addition to the 7 airfields inside the pocket that were used for supply, there were 11 more located outside: Zverovo, Zalsk, Stalino North, Novocherkassk, Luhansk, Holivka, Makeyevka, Kostyanivka, Rostov, Morozovsk, and Tatsinskaya. The last 2 in particular would become even more important. As for the withdrawal movement of the forces from the other side of the Don, these had been successfully carried out in about 2 to 3 days. However, this was at the cost of large supplies. Now, for all the soldiers who suspected more about their situation than they actually knew, the daily hunger began. At first, there were still 200 grams of bread, but just a few days later, it was only 100 grams or less. Canned goods were scarce. Usually only thin soup with a few noodles or rice was available. After the staff of the AOK-6 had arrived in the pocket, there were extensive discussions relatively quickly with the commanding general of the 51st Army Corps, von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, here to the left of Paulus. Seydlitz-Kurzbach had categorically demanded the immediate breakout of the army, regardless of the order to hold, and without regard for the initial joint decision to dig in and hold the pocket. To emphasize his demand, von Seydlitz-Kurzbach had ordered his troops on the evening of November 23rd to independently evacuate a sector in the northeast of the pocket. For the soldiers, this unauthorized and militarily pointless order meant that they had to leave their well-fortified bunkers on the northern line and exchange them for snow holes in the open steppe. Seydlitz's actions were only reported to the 6th Army Command on November 24th, by which time the evacuation could no longer be reversed, as units of the Red Army, taking advantage of the unexpected gift, had immediately advanced rapidly. Only with great effort was Colonel General Paulus able to convince the headstrong Seydlitz-Kurzbach, who had turned from Polis to Solus in captivity, that an immediate breakout of the army to the southwest without outside support was doomed to fail. Nor was there even close to enough ammunition or fuel for a breakout battle through the enemy's main forces in the completely exposed terrain of the snow-covered steppe, so that the breakout would lead to the destruction of the encircled army and its allies. In the following weeks, the German front was steadily pushed back towards Stalingrad. During the air supply operation, the necessary airfields shown in green, Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk, were lost on December 24th during the Soviet Operation Little Saturn, which took place from December 16th to 30th, 1942. But it was precisely the unconditional holding of these 2 airfields by the Army that had been the demand of the Chief of the General Staff of the Air Force, Colonel General Yashonek. Since the front was now retreating further every day, the Luftwaffe supply flights, which had previously been 100 kilometers, now became up to 300 to 400 kilometers longer and more difficult. Now the planes could no longer fly in 3 times a day, but only once, and even then only at night, since the fighter planes could no longer provide air cover that far. The Luftwaffe, which had already been weakened by continuous combat operations, had gathered everything that could fly for the Stalingrad supply effort, including transport gliders, training aircraft, and 6 private planes. But all of them first had to be made winter-ready. Something that would prove to be increasingly difficult since, for the most part, maintenance hangars and wind protection were also lacking. When the planes were finally able to take off, they always had to fly with sufficient fighter escort in bad weather because of the ever-increasing Soviet Air Force and anti-aircraft defenses, meaning in fog, snow, icing, thick cloud cover, and anything else that could make flying more difficult. For the dedicated crews, these dangers were added on top of everything else. All of this became even more intense during the night flights. There were days when the losses caused by weather conditions were greater than those caused by enemy action. In the end, from November 24, 1942 to January 31, 1943, 495 aircraft were lost due to enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, or other causes. That was 5 wings, or an entire air corps. In addition, there were about 1,000 specialized crew members who were lost during the Stalingrad airlift. The losses had been so high that 4 transport units of Air Fleet 4 had to be formally disbanded. From this heavy loss during the Stalingrad supply operation, especially among the training staff, the German Luftwaffe would never recover. Nevertheless, it continued to try to supply the 6th Army until the very end. In addition to Potomnik, a second supply hub was established at Gumrak Airfield, which, like Potomnik, could be successfully defended by the anti-aircraft artillery and fighter planes stationed there. However, when considering the tonnage flown in, it should not be overlooked that most of the German transport aircraft, such as the Junkers 52 or Heinkel 111, had only a relatively small payload capacity. The few Focke-Wulf 200s that were used, this one here was captured by the Red Army at Potomnik in January, played only a minor role in the airlift. For example, fresh meat or bread is much heavier than the concentrated rations. However, that was practically non-existent and had to be brought in from almost 2,000 kilometers away from Germany. Therefore, it's understandable even for those who haven't dealt with Air Force transport vehicles that, from day one, it was actually impossible for the weakened Air Force to fly in the at least 500 tons of supplies needed daily by the Army. However, they did manage to take about 35,000 wounded soldiers with them on the return flights. There was never any doubt that the fate of the 6th Army depended mainly on air supply. After the war, the commitment and disregard for death shown by the crews was recognized. Is this reflected in the literature about the Battle of Stalingrad? When it comes to the main Luftwaffe officials, such as Luftwaffe Chief Göring or his Chief of Staff Jaschelnik, you repeatedly find attributes like reckless, responsible, irresponsible, or boastful, since they promised air supply but did not deliver on it. If criticism is true, considering the scale of the Stalingrad catastrophe is understandable for the German people, who had initially also been lied to. But this ignores the fact that all those responsible for this ultimately failed air supply, from the commander of Air Fleet 4, von Richthofen, to the Chief of Staff at the top of the Luftwaffe High Command, Hans Jeschonnek, were aware of the difficulties and, above all, the uncertainty of supplying an army in winter from the very first minute. And they had also presented this to Hitler. But neither they nor the representatives of the army had been able to prevail against Hitler's erratic decisions. Ask yourself, what else could the Air Force have done but put everything on one card? Tell the 6th Army that, due to the many uncertainties, they did not see themselves in a position to provide air supply, and that the 6th Army should therefore come up with something else. Instead, the Air Force had tried to do what it could, and in the beginning it was only supposed to be for a short period of time. But supplying a motorized army of around 300,000 men, encircled in winter, and about 2,000 kilometers away from Germany, almost effortlessly through an airlift, had never been possible for the German Air Force, neither at the beginning nor now in the middle of the war. especially since the Soviet forces did not simply wait and see how the fate of the Sixth Army would unfold. Instead, they continued their offensives and thus tied down more and more German forces outside the encirclement. On January 10, 1943, the Soviet forces launched their decisive attack on the encirclement in Operation Koltso, also known as Ring. In the process, the Red Army also succeeded in capturing the two airfields shown in yellow, which were vital for supplies: Potomnik on January 16th and Gumrak on January 22nd. The army was pushed back into the city itself, then split up until the last resistance ceased on February 2nd, 1943. Hundreds of thousands had fallen and 95,000 had been taken prisoner, of whom only a few thousand survived. It is a hypothetical question whether an earlier surrender would have given the soldiers of the Sixth Army a better fate. After the exceptionally hard and months-long, very costly battles, that certainly could not have been expected, just as it was not the case after other battles in the Second World War. If you now look for the reasons for the catastrophe of Stalingrad, the question arises as to why the Sixth Army did not break out immediately when the threat of encirclement became apparent. But it was not the order from above to hold Stalingrad that prevented the breakout, but rather the Army's intention to first bring up the forces positioned beyond the Don. In addition, there was a severe shortage of fuel and ammunition. To make a breakout across open fields in the Russian winter against a vastly superior enemy seem at least somewhat reasonable. After all, the commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht had repeatedly promised the Sixth Army both air supply and relief from outside, as did the commander of Army Group Dawn, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, in a radio message. Quote, "We will do everything to get you out." Then, from December 12th to 23rd, 1942, during Operation Winter Storm, the failed attempt by Manstein's army group, with about 50,000 men and 250 tanks, to relieve the Sixth Army against roughly 3 times as many Soviet forces. The Red Army prevented both the breakout and the approach of the relief troops. Moreover, due to a lack of ammunition and fuel, it would hardly have been possible for the exhausted Sixth Army, whose units were already severely weakened by hunger, frostbite, and wounds, to break through the deeply layered Soviet front, and that for several days on an open, almost flat battlefield with no cover. According to the records of those responsible for the Sixth Army at the time, they realistically assumed that, at the code word thunderclap, the army might have been able to advance 12 to 15 kilometers southwest on its own, but would then have become stuck in the steppe, while the relief troops would still have been about 50 kilometers away. Because, as you can see here, Manstein's units never got any closer to the encircled troops. Also, while the relief forces were slowly fighting their way forward, there was never a clear order from Army Group for the Sixth Army to begin breaking out. Since the Army Group itself was repeatedly attacked by superior Soviet forces and was no longer able to advance towards Stalingrad, if we honestly assess all these criteria, we must conclude that the Sixth Army and Field Marshal Paulus could not have carried out a breakout on their own initiative. Because if they had set out too early against a superior enemy who was also expecting the breakout, they would have marched to their doom. The fact that both the supply of the pocket by the overstretched Luftwaffe at the time and the Army's attempt to relieve them ultimately failed can be explained by the enemy's overwhelming superiority. In connection with the other criteria mentioned, such as space, time, and weather conditions, the question remains whether the Sixth Army's decision to hold on to Stalingrad actually prevented an even greater catastrophe in the southern section of the Eastern Front. I believe that this can be answered with yes. Because only the endurance of the army, as well as the stubborn German resistance by the weak German and Allied troops outside the Stalingrad pocket in the area between the Don and Rostov, saved the two German Caucasus armies. In a masterful feat of leadership and troops, they were able to withdraw to the Kuban bridgehead in an operation marked by mud, mire, and heavy fighting, managing to save their valuable artillery as well. The Sixth Army had not been granted this luck. It failed in the winter of 1942 to 43 due to several factors. Because of the vastness of the area and the related issues of supplies and reserves. Because of the arrogance not uncommon on the German side at the time, in underestimating the offensive power and also the patriotism of the Soviet opponent, who had managed, by the fall of 1942, to replace the enormous losses in men and material surprisingly quickly. This growing danger to the Eastern Front had not been detected at all by the Foreign Army's East Department and General Galen. Therefore, they also bear partial responsibility for the catastrophe of Stalingrad. All of this was solely the responsibility of the one who appointed himself Commander-in-Chief of the Army on December 19, 1941. Adolf Hitler, here with Paulus in the center. The Sixth Army had often warned about overstretching and the increasingly stronger enemy. But if, like Hitler did, you stick to the situation map from Rastenburg, 2,000 kilometers away from the events, interfere down to the battalion level, and keep giving the army leadership new hopes against their better judgment, and, on top of that, prefer to get intoxicated by the reports of Knights Cross-bearers instead of facing reality, then a catastrophe like Stalingrad is bound to happen. And there would be further military catastrophes all the way up to the unconditional surrender in May 1945. The Chief of Staff of the Sixth Army, Major General Arthur Schmidt, on the right with Field Marshal Paulus, had given this message to the Army's flown-out pioneer leader, Colonel Herbert Selle, 10 days before the capture shown here on February 3, 1943. Tell everyone that the Sixth Army was betrayed and abandoned by the highest authorities.